Well, with inflation now in full swing and it being common conversation now, just throughout the ordinary day, whenever you're talking to anybody, the topic, if you're in business, seems to always turn to inflation and supply chain constraints, which of course are a direct result of the federal government and the Federal Reserve's stimulus, in which they are just, printing money that has no tie to any kind of production, handing it to people, letting them go and spend it and consume goods, without any connection to production. So therefore, consumption will inevitably eclipse production. You'll end up with more consumption, overconsumption. This is no longer in dispute. This is what we're dealing with right now. And so at this point, the conversation is pivoting away from, hey, are we going to have inflation, to how long this is going to last. And it's sort of a false, it's a false dichotomy between, oh, well, is inflation going to be transitory or not? And I've gone over this before. It's dumb. If the Fed can say that inflation is going to be transitory all they want, transitory has no set meaning. Transitory just means that it's going to end at some point, which of course inflation always does. Even if that means, total collapse of your currency, it's still transitory. You just look at Zimbabwe. Inflation was transitory in Zimbabwe. Inflation was transitory in Weimar Germany. Inflation has been transitory in Argentina for, decades on and off. They'll have really bad inflation and then not so bad, and then really bad and then not so bad. And so the question really is, how long is it going to last specifically? Not whether it will be transitory or not. That's a dumb framing. Don't listen to anybody who puts it that way. Or if they do, if they honestly are making that mistake, set them straight and say, well, yeah, inflation's always transitory. It's a false choice. But the longer that inflation lasts, given that it's going to end at some point, the longer it lasts, the more damage is done to the economy and to the structure of production, the more that it distorts the market and makes it harder for prices to makes prices less reflective of reality, because inflation is never it's never uniform across the entire economy. You don't see every product. If you have 10% inflation, the price of everything doesn't go up 10%. The price of some things go up 500%. You see certain spikes in certain things like lumber or steel or other things, or housing, and then maybe some things might stay about the same. Other things might only go up a little bit. You don't see an even distribution of price increases when you're in a period of high inflation. So getting back to the matter of how long this all will last, I was reading an article in Zero Hedge today, and increasingly Zero Hedge, their editorial stance seems to be shifting in the direction of inflation being a short-term problem. And from what I've understood, the thesis of these people is, at least in principle, correct. I've heard it from many people. Brent Johnson, and the dollar milkshake guy who always wears a bathrobe on camera for some reason, very strange dude, as well as Jeff Snyder. Those guys are the ones I guess I would associate most with this position, with saying, no, really, inflation is going to be transitory, just like Powell says. It's predicated on the idea that, well, okay, so we know that inflation is happening because of the stimulus. So as soon as the stimulus ends, well, then there's no more inflation. Then it's done. Then prices are going to equilibrate and stabilize. But in order for that to be true, stimulus has to end at some point. So when's that going to happen? That's really the question that you have to drill down on here. And I know it's taken me over 4 minutes now, but that's what you have to look at when you're analyzing how long is this inflation going to last. It's really a question of how long is the stimulus going to last. And I don't think you can take for granted that this stimulus is just that it's over now. I think that perhaps the financial community might be too bogged down in the details and say, well, the data looks great on paper, so shouldn't this mean that the federal government and the Fed have met their goals and that they should stop stimulating now? Shouldn't this mean now that the Fed should taper and that the federal government should stop just printing money and handing it to people and sending out free stimmy checks? And the answer to that is no, because that's not what's driving the Fed and the federal government. The federal government is being driven by wanting to buy votes. And when people get free money, they like that. And so the federal government is incentivized to keep sending people money for free. And the Fed, of course, wants to prop up asset markets. And if the Fed slows down the rate of growth of the money supply and stops printing so much money and injecting it, by buying up bonds and trying to, launder money into the stock market, well, then they're not going to meet their goal of continually propping up and raising asset prices. So I just don't see why people presuppose, whether it be the editors at Zero Hedge, Jeff Snyder, or Brent Johnson, or any of these other guys who are, and again, I wish they were right. This would be much better to me. I think the much better case scenario at this point would be if the government just stops stimulating and lets everything crash. That would be great. But I just don't see why they would do that, because they haven't done that so far. Everything that we've seen over the last few years is that the federal government and the Federal Reserve both want to keep the game going for as long as possible. They want to keep pushing things higher and higher. They're not going to just take away the punch bowl. And, Zero Hedge's article today that I was reading, it played off of an old good maxim of economics that you might have heard, and that is that the cure for higher prices is higher prices. In that when the price of something goes up, that is going to reduce the quantity demanded. In other words, if the price of something goes up, people will buy less of it. And if people buy less of something, then the price is going to go down. And so this is how prices, again, equilibrate. This is how markets work. But I think everyone who would be listening to this channel understands that we do not live in a market anymore. We haven't lived in a market since well before I was born. And so, yes, in the abstract, if prices of housing, which is what Zero Hedge was talking about today in their rather short article, I guess I'll link that, although there was not a whole lot to read there, so I don't hate on me if I don't remember to link to it, because it wasn't that important anyway. But they were talking about the sentiment of housing buyers and showing how people plan on spending less money on housing over the next 6 months. Their plans to buy a house, in aggregate, of course, individual people, whether they've just bought a house, of course, they're not going to plan on buying one in the future, but people overall, the intentions to buy homes, cars, and they cited one other category, is declining. And that they assert is because of higher prices, and that's probably true. I talked about this quite recently, at how I don't know anybody who could afford to buy a house in this market. Or at least people who could afford to buy a house couldn't afford to buy a house that they would want to live in, put it that way. I look at neighborhoods now that are around, $250,000 to $300,000, and I say, well, the people I know who currently live in that neighborhood, and those who don't live there but would like to live in that neighborhood, not going to pay $300,000 for one of those houses. And the people I know who could afford to pay $300,000 for a house are not going to move into that neighborhood. And so if that's the case, in the aggregate, well, then the obvious thing is that, well, then people are going to stop buying houses at that price. And they're going to wait, and they're just going to refrain from consumption because the price got too high for them. And and then therefore the only thing that can happen is for prices to fall until people start buying again. In other words, prices are rising faster than people's incomes are rising or are being sustained by the stimulus. This is what I was talking about earlier when I said that inflation is non-uniform. And so in other words, if things that you want to buy, let's say the stimulus is increasing your income. Your income is higher now than it otherwise would have been, either because you would have lost your job and were making nothing, or you would have had to take a pay cut, or because now the stimulus is paying you more than you otherwise would have been making. Anyway, if that increase in your income as a result of the stimulus payments is less than the increase in prices of whatever it is you're looking to buy, a car, for example, or a home, well, then you're going to be less likely than you were before to buy a house or a car, not more likely. Your purchasing power has decreased, in other words, as a result of the stimulus. because I think it's, I don't think it's controversial to say that without the Federal Reserve and the federal government propping up the U.S. economy and consumption over the past year, we would have had a major deflation in asset prices in this country. Housing prices would have already begun to collapse, and housing would be much more affordable now than it than it is today. And so I think that the current sort of deflationary narrative is that, okay, so stimulus has led to this is where we are as a result of the stimulus. The stimulus isn't going to keep flowing, and therefore people aren't going to buy at these high prices, and therefore prices must fall. That, I think, is the thesis. But why necessarily would the Federal Reserve and the federal government stop because of this? If you look at just how they've acted in the past, I think it's much more likely that the Federal Reserve and the federal government will say, gee, people aren't buying because prices are too high. Well, we need to pay people more. I mean, that's the whole logic behind the minimum wage. There is no economic logic behind having a minimum wage. People say, oh, well, it's too expensive to live in America, so we need to raise the minimum wage. And then they raise the minimum wage, and the cost of living goes up even more in America. Now, I'm not saying, not to get sidetracked, I'm not saying that raising the minimum wage is the reason why the cost of living rises, but I'm just saying it's contribution to it, and it's a Band-Aid solution. You're not getting at the heart of the problem. If people can't afford to live in this country, raising the minimum wage is not, that's not a solution. But that's never stopped the government from doing it and from continually, raising the minimum wage over time. And so the same, I think, would be true with the stimulus, which has turned into a de facto universal basic income. And so if that universal basic income that has been doled out so far is insufficient, I think that you're more likely to see more stimulus, not less stimulus, which, of course, would accelerate the rate of inflation. Because even if you have less people buying homes and less people want to rent or whatever, volume, I think you're going to, I can't remember where I saw it. I just saw it within today or yesterday. I saw a great chart that was showing the collapse in volume of existing home sales. I'll try and find it, but then again, I don't throw a bunch of charts into my videos because I don't do videos really. This is sort of an audio podcast essentially. But maybe I'll try and make the the one image that I use for this existing home sales. But then again, that will make sense with the rest of what I was talking about today. So you know what? Screw that. What you need to know, existing home sales in 2021 are in the decline. Less people are selling their homes. There's less homes for sale, which again is going to create, that's an inventory problem. It's less supply, and so that is going to drive up prices, even if demand remains constant. Even if demand falls, if supply falls faster, then you're still going to see a rise in prices. Demand needs to fall faster than supply in order for prices to fall. And so a lot of the reason why I think existing home sales are falling is because people who live in homes right now know that if they sell their home, sure, they're going to get a lot of more money for it than they paid for it, even if they bought it a year or a year and a half ago. But once they get that money, they can't take it and buy another house. So what do they do? So what's the point in selling? You can't move anywhere. Sure, you sell your overpriced house and go and buy another overpriced house, which will probably be not as nice because prices are rising so fast that in the time that it takes you to sell your house and buy another one, prices have risen, and so you have to buy a crappier house than you came from. All you're doing is giving up, your equity. Although I guess that equity would disappear if housing prices were to decline anyway, so it doesn't make that big of a difference. But still, psychologically, people are not, in this kind of a market, don't want to sell their houses. And so if rising prices, rather than incentivizing people to sell, in many cases disincentivizes people to sell because of the rate at which prices are rising. Prices haven't stabilized, at a really high level and stayed flat. It looks like they keep going up. And so that creates you have a sort of two effects there. One, people go, well, if I just hang on to it longer, it'll be worth even more, which I think that's a small percentage of people. I think that the Keynesians way overestimate how people think like that. That they're going, oh, well, there's deflation, so I better just, sit tight and wait for prices, or wait for things to, deflation is kind of a hard word to understand this, but deflation in the sense that that the home, which is their asset in this case, is gaining in value. And it's the same way that they talk about, well, people just sit on their money if there's deflation. If all the goods are getting cheaper, well, then people, if the price of your money is appreciating, well, the Keynesians say, oh, well, you're just going to sit on your money and not spend it. That is true to a certain extent, but not nearly to the extent that they say, and the same is true here in houses. There is going to be a small contingent of people who say, you know what, I'm going to sit on my house longer and longer and wait for, because the price is going up and up and up. I want to wait, for it to keep going up before I sell. But I think a much bigger share of that is people who see the price continuing to go up and go, gee, if I sell out of this house, where am I going to go? I'm not going to be able to afford to live anywhere else. And that is what's driving them. So you have this inverse relationship between the price and people's propensity to sell their home in this current environment. And so that, I think, is going to a certain point, can continue to keep pushing prices higher and higher. Now, for how long that lasts, that's until the consumer hits a wall, when the federal government decides to stop pumping up their consumption, when the Fed stops pumping it up too. The Fed and the federal government are playing an inflationary game of chicken. So the moral of the story here, to wrap up, is that I'm not so sure that we've seen the last of stimulus in this current environment. I don't know how much longer this charade will continue to be carried out by the authorities, but I have not seen any indication that they're done yet. Now, they might be. I'm not saying that they're not. It's not impossible that, this last $1,400 stimulus check really was the last one, and no more is coming. And that, like Zero Hedge says, in September, they're going to let the additional unemployment benefits sort of roll off and quit and expire, which a lot of red states are already doing, and so maybe that movement will pick up momentum, and these additional unemployment benefits will start rolling off, and there will be less free money flowing into the system. Inflation will slow down, and and that will lead to a collapse in prices. But if it's that easy to see it coming, I can't imagine the Fed just allowing it to happen. The federal government and the Fed are not going to just, wait 6 months on this ticking time bomb and let things implode. Our authorities have a very high time preference, and they don't know how to just take their medicine. Of course, if at any point in all this they quit with doing what they were doing, and they just took their medicine and they accepted the pain, the pain would have been less than what it would be if they do it today. The longer they put it off, the more pain there will be. And so as of now, my base case for this whole situation is still that it will only end when the Fed and the federal government lose their ability to continue to prop things up. I think that they're going to try and prop things up for as long as they can. They're not going to just let things crash, because if they had planned on doing that, they would have done it back in 2018. It wouldn't have been nearly as bad as it is now, but they didn't. The Fed flip-flopped. Balance sheet was no longer, balance sheet runoff was taken off of autopilot. They stopped hiking rates. So that was the end of it. At that point, that was a pivot point where it became clear that the U.S. was going to go down an inflationary path at some point. In order to change that base case, we would need to see a change in sentiment, particularly at the Fed. But I have not seen any indication that the Fed is going to pivot back in the other direction. We're hearing murmurs about tapering. And that, of course, is because this is a whole huge can. Do I really want to get into taper talk 19 minutes in? Oh, this could go 40 minutes if I start talking about tapering now. Okay, so basically there's pressure on the Fed to taper their bond purchases because the commercial banking system needs Treasury bills, Treasury bonds as collateral to do their financial wizardry and magically turn something that yields 0 interest into something that yields, a few percentage points of interest, like 3% or something. I haven't talked about this because I've been trying to understand more about how they do that, how they leverage their Treasury holdings to turn that into an actual, not positive rate of interest, but, less negative rate of interest. And so we've been seeing a spike in reverse repos at the Fed, which I talked about previously, and that is commercial banks going to the Fed and trying to borrow some of their treasuries so that they can go off and do their financial wizardry. This would be the motivation for the Fed to taper its bond purchases so that it stops sucking so many bonds out of the commercial banking system, leaves some more for them to do their thing with. But the problem with that is that if the Fed does that, yields could start to rise, asset prices could start to fall across the board, even if it's only a little bit. Once that, you don't want to let, the Fed does not want to let that market crash genie out of the bottle. And so I think it's more likely that the Fed, rather than tapering its bond purchases program, encourages the Treasury Department to issue more bonds. Because remember, I talked about not too long ago, the Treasury has been spending money out of the Treasury General account and been issuing far less bonds than it otherwise would have, considering how much it's been spending. So if the Treasury shifts and starts issuing more bonds, then the whole impetus for the Fed to taper, allegedly, is going to disappear. So I think I'm going to end it there. I've seen no pivot at the Fed to suggest that the Fed is going to shift to a deflationary stance.